Welcome back to another segment of Behind the Scenes of the Waltons. Today I'm doing another segment of Ask Judy, where I am taking more of your questions. If you are enjoying these segments, please do hit like and subscribe. I have a question here from Rick, who said, realizing that the actors were playing characters on the Waltons, how close were they to who they really were in real life? There's always, with most characters, a piece of us that we put into characters. I mean, unless you're playing something that's really, really different from you. But you pull from how you relate to the character. You pull from aspects of yourself that help you to build that and layer that character. So some characters are going to be much closer to you. I remember hearing that Will Geer felt that this character was probably the closest to him of any character he had done. I think there was so much of Will in Grandpa, and in a lot of cases I think it was very easy for him to just sort of be Will. So that was a case of there being a lot of Will in that character. Other people, of course, Jon Walmsley really is an insanely talented musician. So those musical aspects of Jason were really, I think, developed because of Jon's personal musical ability. I was not a nurse, but I was a tomboy, loved sports, so all of that aspect, and the horses. I rode horses from the time I was a teenager. So those were elements that were like me. The fact that I was strong and independent and had strong opinions, those I think were pieces of me. But the specific going down the avenue of becoming a nurse was not a career path that I ever looked at personally. So that wasn't the same. Eric Scott, of course, Ben became kind of a businessman. He worked in the lumber mill, but he also was a bit of an entrepreneur. And Eric did pull a lot of himself into Ben, and as it turns out, has gone into business since the Waltons ended. So, where does art imitate life? Where does life imitate art? Who knows? Cammie, of course, became a teacher, which Elizabeth was an avid reader, and she was curious about things and interested in nature and all sorts of things around her. And there's a lot of Cammie in that. Precocious, wise for her years, all Elizabeth and Cammie. David's, sort of a quieter, more deep thinking, sensitive sort of person. And I think we saw that in Jim Bob. So Mary, the obvious thing, she's beautiful and she was playing a character that was beautiful. And yet, the vulnerabilities in there and wanting to be more than just a pretty face, those things you can't help. And the fact that we were all allowed to go through our awkward years, our teenage years and things like that, and make those transitions. I think we all related to aspects of things we went through personally and with our characters. Paige asked an interesting question. She said, if you were to direct an episode for the show now in this decade, what would it be like if you were to direct one? Would there be anyone you would want to make an appearance in your episode? Wow, that's a really tough thing. I mean, if our cast, our original Walton cast, were to come together to do some sort of episode, or they wanted to recreate the show in a more up-to-date version, I think that what we love most and what speaks most to people about the Waltons is the human element, the humanity of it, the characters and the layers of those characters and how true they are. So those would be the things that would be most important to me. And also the look, the early years of the Waltons, it didn't look too glamorous. It wasn't necessarily real brightly colored. It was a little more shadowy in some of the house. So I think those elements would appeal to me. So I would find it interesting to work with a story that maybe had a reason why the Waltons weren't in a brightly lit place. Perhaps there's a power outage. Perhaps they go to, that maybe Jon eventually built that house on the mountain, but maybe it hasn't been lived in for some time. So maybe there's cobwebs and there's things that give it the space character and that have that shadowy element where things weren't too neat and clean and pretty, firelight and candles, and but for it really to be more about the family and not so much about new gadgets and what's happening today and how different we are, but more about the ways in which they're the same. They're still the same people. They have the same core values. So I think that would appeal to me in terms of developing a story that really still spoke to who those characters are that we developed and that everybody grew to love. Thank you very much. So it's an interesting question and would certainly be an interesting challenge. That question from Paige sort of leads into this next question from Mark, who says, Russell Metty is a favorite cinematographer of mine, a master of light and shadow with an emphasis on the dark areas of the composition. It is pretty epic that he shot 57 episodes of The Waltons. Can you talk about working with Russell and possibly contrast that with others who held that position over the course of the series? Russell Metty, yes, a master. He came up through the golden age of Hollywood. He worked. I looked up some of the aspects of his career and his biography, and so I just thought I'd share a little bit of that with you, where it says that he worked with top directors such as John Huston, Stanley Kubrick, Steven Spielberg, and Orson Welles. His ability to create effects with black and white contrast while shooting twilight and night were on display in 2 films he shot for Welles, The Stranger and the classic Touch of Evil, the latter showing his mastery of complex crane shots. I'm going to put a link to that opening sequence from A Touch of Evil in the description of this YouTube segment above, and take a look, click onto it and watch that, because it is sort of a single shot that goes all over the place, and there's quite a history to how that was all crafted. It took them all day to set up and rehearse and everything, and they only had a small window of time to be able to actually get that shot, so it's quite something. So that was one of those film students and directors and people study the work of that scene as part of their curriculum sometimes. So he was nominated for a number of awards, including a Primetime Emmy for Outstanding Achievement in Cinematography for The Waltons, and also he was nominated for an Emmy for the made-for-television Tribes for ABC. And then he was nominated for Best Cinematography for the film Flower Drum Song, and of course won Best Cinematography for Spartacus. So we were so fortunate to work with Russell, and he really set the tone for the show in those early episodes. Of course, The Homecoming had a wonderful look to it, but we had 5 weeks to shoot that. On The Waltons, we had 6.5 days. So Russ was really good at working fast, and he worked very tightly with his electrician, his gaffer, who is like the chief electrician. A gaffer, for those of you, is described as, in film and television crews, the gaffer or chief lighting technician is the head electrician responsible for the execution of the lighting plan for a production, and the gaffer's assistant is the best boy electric. So if you've heard those terms, there's a little bit of a definition of what it is. So Earl Williman Jr. was the gaffer under Russ, and Russ would sit I'm sitting in a tall director's chair here, and Russ would sit in his tall director chair. He often smoked a cigar, and he would sort of like, I remember it's almost sounding like he was grunting. He'd go, and his gaffer knew what he wanted. So there was like a shorthand there, and so things would get moved around, and the gaffer would do a lot of the actual hands-on physical work of with the light meter and testing things and distances and all that. But Russ knew exactly what it was going to look like. He knew exactly what he wanted, what his lights were that were available to him, and he was in his later years. He maybe wasn't in really great health. I think that was why he liked working the Waltons, because it wasn't quite so grueling a schedule. And so we were just really, really so lucky to have him, because he really set the tone for the look of the show in those early seasons. And what I noticed later was that the show got a little brighter and a little more colorful as the seasons went on. Perhaps they felt that we were out of the Depression, so things were a little better for the family, so things could brighten up. And I also found sometimes that some of the later cinematographers, didn't seem to work quite as fast as Russ to get the effect. So he'd been doing it forever, and he knew the shortcuts. So I thank you so much for asking about Russ, because he was a huge, huge piece of the success of our show, I feel, in these early seasons. That's what I have for you for this segment of Ask Judy. I will be back with more behind the scenes of the Waltons and more segments of Ask Judy. Thank you for watching.